Hello, today we're looking at reproduction in plants. So here we have some plants. You can get a copy of this diagram in the description below along with all the other diagrams. Important thing though is that plants, like all living things, must reproduce. They must reproduce in order for the survival of their species. With plants, this is often done by joining what we call gametes. This is an important key term, so we should make a note of what that means. Gametes are sometimes called the sex cells, and when we're talking about plants, we have two kinds of sex cells. We have the male sex cell, which is the pollen, and we have the female sex cell, or the female sex cells, female, and these would be what we call ova or eggs. Eggs is another word or another way of saying ova. If you have just one, we call that an ovum. It's just a science word for eggs that can be fertilized. How are the sex cells joined? How do pollen grains and egg cells join? Well, there's a couple of different ways in which this can happen. But the process is called pollination. It can be done either by insects. Common example is the bee. It can be done by insects or animals, in fact. But it can also be done by the wind, where pollen grains are blown onto or nearby egg cells, and then pollination happens, which can lead to fertilization. So let's have a look at the labels for a flower. So here is a diagram of a flower, and the flower is the organ of reproduction in certain types of plant. And we need to know some key labels. So I think we'll start off with the easy one over here. That's the petal, often nice and colourful. Over this side we have that little yellow bit at the top called the anther and a filament. And these are commonly described as the male parts of a plant, or a flower should we say. The male parts of a flower. Over the other side we have something called the stigma and the style. And these are often referred to as the female parts of the plant. So this flower has both male and female parts. Down here we have an ovary, and inside the ovary there's an ovum. There isn't, but there is now. There's an ovum or an egg. And a couple of parts I missed out on the diagram. These are quite leafy parts at the bottom here, and this on the right hand side is a sepal. There are actually two sepals there, but I've just labeled the one on the right hand side. That's there to help protect the growing flower. Important to remember that the anther is the part of the plant that produces pollen, the male sex gamete. So let's take a look and see one example of how pollination happens in flowers. Before we do that, let's see if we can practice the labels. This is a photograph of a flower. See if you can pause here and label the different parts. This is upside down compared to the one we had before, but that's just the way the flower was growing when I saw it and took the photograph. But let's have a look at the labels. We have a petal there, nice orangey color. There's the stigma and the style. And over on the left hand side, we have the filament that's holding the anther in place. So hopefully you got some, if not all of those labels for a flower. Ovary is not actually in this diagram, in this photograph, but it will be somewhere there if we took a photograph of the whole thing. So let's take a look and see how pollination works. This is an example of insect pollination, and we're going to use the common example of the bee. And pollination is when the pollen is transferred from an anther to a stigma. It says here transferred to an egg, but actually when it's transferred from an anther to a stigma, sometimes of the same plant, sometimes of a different plant. Here I've drawn what we might often find in flowers. This is what's called nectar, and nectar is like a sugary solution, a sugary liquid that attracts bees, along with the petals, the pretty colors, the nice colors, and the nectar attracts the bee. So here comes the bee, makes its way into the flower to get the nectar. As it does that, it picks up some pollen from the anthers. So we can add the little pollen grains onto the bee there. There's some pollen grains. And then as it flies off, pollen grains there. As it flies off to another plant, another flower, it's going to go there to get some more nectar. But as it does that, there's a good chance that it will deposit or drop some of the pollen grains from the first plant onto the stigma of the second plant. So some pollen lands on the stigma. There we go. This is pollination, insect pollination. So what happens next? So here we have the flower. If we just enlarge the stigma, and just show some pollen grains there, we can see that the pollen grains will move down the style and meet with the eggs that are in the ovary. So the pollen joins the egg, or an ovum, and this process is called fertilization. Fertilization. And after fertilization, we get the production of a seed. A seed is produced. Fertilization is when the pollen joins the egg. Really important not to mix this up. So don't mix this up with pollination, which is different. Don't mix fertilization up with pollination. Pollination is when we transfer the pollen from the anther to the stigma. Fertilization is the joining of the pollen and the egg. So there's the pollen grain on the stigma. It travels down the style until it reaches an egg. So each pollen grain will join with an egg. This is called fertilization, and then we get the production of a seed. A seed is produced, which produces a new plant under the right conditions. So that's it, reproduction in plants, and an example of how insect pollination can lead to the production of new seeds and new plants. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.